The wind had teeth. It bit at Eli Carson's raw-boned face, scraping away the last of his warmth and leaving nothing but a hollow ache that settled deep in his marrow. The sky above was a sheet of pewter, vast and unforgiving, stretched tight over a land that had forgotten the color green. Dust, the fine gray powder of a world worn down to its bones, swirled in the wind's wake, tasting of ash and something metallic and old, like a forgotten battlefield. It was the smell of blood, dried and scoured by the merciless Texas sun, a scent that clung to the air long after the dying was done. Eli rode with his head bowed against the gale, the reins loose in his chapped hands. His horse, a sturdy buckskin named Gideon, plodded onward with a weary patience that Eli could no longer muster. Every step the horse took was a small, jolting reminder of the hole that had been torn in the world. They were coming from the lonely rise 2 miles back, a small mound of earth topped by a single, wind-twisted oak. There was a fresh scar in the ground there now, a plot of turned-over dirt that held what was left of his younger brother, Jacob. The grief was a physical thing, a stone in his gut. It was cold and heavy, and it radiated a fury so pure it felt like its own source of heat. Jacob, with his easy grin and eyes the color of a summer sky, was gone, stolen, taken by a flash of violence that had swept down from the hills 2 days ago, a wave of painted faces and war cries that had ended with smoke coiling from a neighbor's barn, and Jacob lying face down in the dirt, a Comanche arrow buried deep in his back. Eli had helped hunt them down. He had ridden with the other ranchers, his rifle hot in his hands, his heart a knot of vengeance. They had chased the raiders back into the broken lands, exchanging fire until the sun bled out across the horizon. Some fell on both sides. Not enough, Eli thought. Not nearly enough to pay for Jacob. Now, there was only the ride home. The homestead felt 100 miles away, a place that no longer held any meaning. What was a house without the laughter that was supposed to fill it? What was a ranch without the brother who was meant to build it alongside him? He was adrift in a sea of his own bitterness, the silence of the plains pressing in on him, broken only by the mournful whistle of the wind through brittle grama grass. He guided Gideon toward the shallow cut of Willow Creek, its water running low and muddy, a brown ribbon winding through the desolation. The horse needed to drink, and Eli needed a moment to let the fire in his chest cool to embers. He dismounted, his joints stiff and protesting, and led the horse to the water's edge. As Gideon lowered his head, Eli's gaze swept the creek bed, a habit born of years spent in a land that was always watching. And that is when he saw her. At first, she was just a heap of buckskin and dark hair, a smudge of shadow against the pale mud, nearly invisible. He thought it was a dead deer, or perhaps one of the raiders who had not made it back to the hills. A grim satisfaction flickered within him. Good. One less to trouble the world. He took a step closer, his hand dropping to the Colt Peacemaker holstered at his hip. He would make sure. But it was not a man. As he drew nearer, he saw the slender shape of her, the way the tattered deerskin dress clung to a woman's form. She was lying on her side, half submerged in the cold, silty water, her face turned away from him. One leg was twisted at an unnatural angle, and a dark stain, almost black in the failing light, spread across the fabric over her ribs. Her hair, long and unbound, fanned out in the water like black ink. She was Comanche, the beaded patterns on her torn dress, the single feather still woven into a braid. It was unmistakable. She was one of them, one of the people who had put his brother in the ground. The rage that had been simmering inside him roared back to life, hot and blinding. His fingers tightened on the grip of his pistol. It would be so easy, a mercy, even. She was clearly dying. A single shot would end her suffering and satisfy the jagged need for retribution that clawed at his soul. His thumb found the hammer, the metallic click loud in the unnerving quiet. He saw Jacob's face behind his eyes, the life fading from it, and his jaw clenched so hard a muscle jumped. He raised the pistol, the barrel steady, aimed at the back of her head. He could do this for Jacob, for every settler who had ever lost someone to a painted arrow or a stolen knight. He was the justice this land demanded. She stirred. It was a small movement, a shudder that ran through her body, a low moan, softer than the wind, escaped her lips. Her head turned slightly, and he saw her profile. She was young, younger than Jacob, even. Her face was streaked with mud and blood, but beneath it, he could see the fine lines of her cheekbones, the curve of her jaw. Her eyes fluttered open, dark and clouded with pain. They found his, and for a long moment, the world stood still. There was no fear in them. Not at first. There was defiance, a flicker of the same wild pride he had seen in the warriors he had fought. It was a look that said she would not beg, but then the pain washed over her, and the pride fractured, replaced by a raw, desperate vulnerability. Her lips, cracked and pale, parted. The words were a ghost of a sound, a breath of air shaped into a plea. "Please, don't let me die!" The whisper cut through Eli's hatred like a razor. It was not the cry of a warrior or the snarl of an enemy. It was the plea of a girl who was afraid of the dark, of the cold, of the final. Lonely silence. It was a sound he understood. It was the same fear he had seen in Jacob's eyes as he lay bleeding in the dust. His hand trembled. The weight of the gun suddenly felt immense, an impossible burden. He looked from her face to the endless, empty horizon, and the certainty that had guided him for the past 2 days crumbled into dust. What was he doing? Was this justice? Or was it just more killing? Another drop of blood in a land already soaked in it. He could not do it. He lowered the pistol, the hammer falling with a soft, defeated click. For a long moment, he just stood there, torn between the man he was supposed to be, the grieving brother, the avenger, and the man he was in that instant, a man looking at a dying child. The wind howled its indifference. With a curse that was half prayer, half sob, he holstered his weapon. He knelt beside her in the mud, his knees sinking into the cold ooze. "Damn you," he whispered, though he did not know if he was talking to her, to God, or to himself. He slipped his arms beneath her, one under her shoulders, the other under her knees. She was lighter than he expected, a fragile collection of bones. She flinched at his touch, a sharp intake of breath, but she was too weak to resist. As he lifted her from the creek, her head lolled against his chest. Her skin was fever-hot against his own. The ride back was a blur of paranoia. Every shadow was a neighbor, every gust of wind the sound of approaching hoofbeats. He kept Gideon to the low ground, avoiding the main trail. His body curved around the girl to shield her from the worst of the wind. He could feel the ragged rhythm of her breathing, shallow and fast. She was burning up. If he did not get her warm and tend to her wounds, the cold and the fever would finish what the skirmish had started. His homestead was a small, lonely outpost against the vastness of the plains, a modest clapboard house, a sturdy barn, and a few corrals. It was his whole world, and he was about to risk it all for an enemy. He saw the lanterns of his 2 ranch hands, Silas and Jeb, moving between the bunkhouse and the main house. He heard their voices, muffled by the wind, calling out to each other. They were good men, but they were men who had just lost friends in the raid. They were searching for what they called the savages. They would see the girl in his arms and see only a target. Eli steered Gideon toward the dark bulk of the barn, sliding off the horse as quietly as he could. He carried the girl inside, the familiar smell of hay, leather, and animals wrapping around them. It was his sanctuary, a place of peace. Now, it was a hiding place. He found an empty stall in the back, one filled with clean, sweet-smelling hay. He laid her down gently, arranging the hay into a makeshift bed. She did not stir. "Stay here, Gideon," he whispered to the horse. leaving him untethered in the main aisle. He grabbed an old horse blanket from a hook and draped it over her. Then he slipped out of the barn and walked toward the lights of the house, schooling his face into a mask of weary normalcy. "Any sign of them, boss?" Silas called out, his face grim in the lantern light. Eli shook his head, forcing the lie past the lump in his throat. "Nothing. Wind's wiped the tracks clean. They're long gone." "We'll get 'em," Jeb said, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into the dirt. "We'll get every last one of them for what they did to Jacob." Eli's stomach twisted. "Go on and get some rest," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. "I'll check on the stock." He waited until their lights disappeared into the bunkhouse before he went to work. He gathered what he needed from the house in secret: the medicine box with its rolls of linen bandages, carbolic acid, and laudanum, a bucket of clean water from the well, a few clean rags. He took a bottle of whiskey, 2, some for the wound, some for him. When he returned to the barn, she was awake. Her dark eyes followed him as he approached the stall, wide with a terror that made his heart ache. She tried to push herself up, to scramble away from him, but a sharp cry of pain tore from her throat and she fell back into the hay. She expected violence. He could see it in the way she watched his hands, in the way her body tensed as if bracing for a blow. He was a white man and she was a Comanche. In their world, that meant only one thing. "I am not going to hurt you," he said softly, keeping his voice low and steady. He knelt outside the stall, placing the supplies on the ground between them, showing her his empty hands. "You are hurt. I want to help." She said nothing, just watched him with that burning, fearful gaze. He knew that words were useless. His actions were all that would matter. He entered the stall slowly, moving with the same deliberate calm he used to gentle a spooked horse. He set the bucket of water down and uncorked the whiskey. The sharp smell filled the small space. First, he needed to see the damage. Her dress was torn along the side, the fabric stiff and dark with dried blood. The wound was somewhere beneath it. This was the hardest part. He knew what he had to do, but the thought of it made his hands feel clumsy and cruel. He had to remove the soiled fabric to clean the wound. He had to touch her. He reached for the hem of the buckskin. Her reaction was immediate and violent. She recoiled, a guttural sound of fear rising in her throat. "No," she rasped, her voice thick with panic. "Do not." "I have to," he said, his voice pleading. "I have to clean it, or the fever will take you." He tried again, and this time she found the strength to push his hand away. "No!" she cried, the words sharp with terror. Her eyes were wild, darting around the dark barn as if seeking an escape that was not there. Eli's heart broke for her. He saw not an enemy, but a terrified girl, wounded and at the mercy of a man she had every reason to despise and fear. He understood her terror. He knew what his people did to hers when there were no witnesses. He backed away slightly, raising his hands in a gesture of peace. "All right," he said. "All right, I will not, but I need to get to the wound." He took his knife from his belt. Her eyes widened further, and he quickly turned the blade away from her, using it to cut a long strip from his own clean shirt. "See, just for bandages. Now, can I just cut the dress? I will not look. I swear it." She watched him for a long moment, her chest rising and falling in ragged breaths. The fight seemed to drain out of her, replaced by a weary resignation. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. His hands trembled as he used the point of his knife to carefully slice through the deerskin, cutting upward from the tear along her ribs. He kept his eyes fixed on the wound itself, a nasty gash just below her ribs, inflamed and angry-looking. He did his best to avert his gaze from anything else, focusing only on the task. The act was purely medical, but it felt like a profound violation, an intimacy that was both necessary and profane. He was acutely aware of her skin, of the frantic pulse beating in her throat, of the quiet shudders that racked her body. He worked with a quiet intensity, his hands surprisingly gentle as he cleaned the wound with whiskey-soaked rags. She cried out when the alcohol stung, her fingers digging into the hay, but she did not fight him again. He worked as quickly as he could, his own guilt a silent, third presence in the stall. The wind howled outside, a lonely and mournful sound that echoed the desolation in his own heart. He wrapped her ribs tightly with the clean linen, his knuckles brushing against her feverish skin. Each touch felt like a brand. When he was done, he pulled the horse blanket up to her chin. Her eyes were closed now, exhaustion having finally claimed her. In the dim light of his lantern, he could see the faint tracery of blue veins beneath the skin of her eyelids. She looked impossibly fragile. He sat back on his heels, the whiskey bottle in his hand, and took a long, burning swallow. The silence in the barn was thick and heavy. Outside, the world was hunting for her. Inside, he was her keeper, her doctor, her jailer. She began to murmur in her sleep, her brow furrowed in pain. The words were a mix of sounds he did not recognize, her own tongue, and broken, fragmented English. Brother, she whispered, a tear slipping from the corner of her eye to trace a clean path through the grime on her cheek. Fire! So much fire! Eli froze, the bottle halfway to his lips. Fire! A brother! His mind flashed back, unbidden, to a scene from 3 years ago. It was not a raid, but what the army had called a pacification, a punitive expedition against a Comanche band accused of rustling cattle. Eli had been younger then, full of fire and a certainty that had long since curdled into something sour. He had ridden with the volunteer militia. He remembered the chaos, the smoke, the smell of burning lodges. He remembered the faces, twisted in fear and anger. He had fired his rifle. He had followed orders. He had been a part of it. Could it be? Was it possible that he had helped destroy her home, her family? The thought landed in his gut like a chunk of ice. The guilt he felt over Jacob's death was sharp and fresh. But this was something older, deeper, a guilt that implicated his very soul. He looked down at the sleeping girl, at the dark hair spread across the pale hay, and he saw the ghost of a burning village reflected in her closed eyes. He had thought his hatred was a righteous thing, a clean flame of vengeance for his brother. But now, it felt murky and wrong. The lines he had drawn in the sand, settler and savage, victim and aggressor, were dissolving into the mud at his feet. She had lost a brother. He had lost a brother. They were both survivors of the same brutal, unending war, a war he had willingly fought. He stayed there in the cold barn for hours, watching her breathe, listening to the wind rage against the wooden walls. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that he could not turn her out. He could not let her die. Whatever the cost, whatever the risk, her life was now his responsibility. He had found her by the creek, but in a way, he had been lost right alongside her. He swore a silent oath in the darkness, a promise made to her, to the ghost of his brother, and to the man he hoped he could still become. He would keep her alive, even if it meant his own ruin. The days that followed fell into a secret, fragile rhythm. Time inside the barn seemed to move differently, measured not by the sun's arc across the sky, but by the slow, painful mending of a life for the world outside. Eli Carson was a man consumed by two things: grief for his brother and a sudden, obsessive concern for a lame mare. He told Silas and Jeb the horse had taken a bad turn, a deep stone bruise that festered in the hoof. He said she needed quiet and darkness to heal, and that he would tend to her himself. It was a plausible lie, and his men, seeing the hollows under his eyes and the grim set of his jaw, chalked it up to the strange ways grief could work on a man. They left him to it, offering their sympathies but keeping their distance. Each morning before dawn, and every evening after the sun had bled out behind the hills, Eli would make the journey to the barn. He carried a small pail with water and a plate of whatever he could spare from his own quiet meals: a piece of bread, some salted pork, a baked potato. He would enter the barn, his footsteps muffled by the hay-strewn floor, and find her in the back stall, a silent shadow in the gloom. In the beginning, she refused to look at him. She would sit with her back against the rough-hewn planks, her knees drawn up to her chest, her gaze fixed on some distant point beyond the barn walls. He would set the food and water down just inside the stall and retreat, watching from the main aisle until she finally, tentatively, reached for it. She ate like a wild thing, quick and watchful, her eyes never leaving the shadows where he stood. She never spoke a word. The barn became a cathedral of silence, the air thick with the unspoken things that lay between them. His guilt, her fear, their shared and separate sorrows. He would talk to her sometimes, his voice low and calm, the way a man might speak to a frightened animal. He told her about the weather, about the work he had done that day, about his horse. Gideon. He never mentioned his brother. He never mentioned the raid. He did not ask her for her name. He simply filled the silence with the mundane details of his life, hoping the sound of his voice would become a thing of comfort rather than a threat. She gave no sign that she heard him, but he continued anyway. It felt important, somehow, to prove that he was more than just a man with a gun. The cold deepened as the days passed, a bitter, damp chill that seeped through the cracks in the barn walls. The nights were the worst. The wind moaned around the eaves, a constant, lonely cry. Eli brought her more blankets, thick wool ones from his own house, leaving them folded at the entrance to her stall. One night, the temperature plummeted, and a raw, freezing wind blew in from the north. A deep unease settled over him as he sat in his quiet house, the fire in the hearth doing little to warm the chill inside him. He could not shake the image of her, alone in the dark, with only a few blankets against the biting cold. Finally, he could stand it no longer. He pulled on his coat, lit a lantern, and walked through the howling wind to the barn. The air inside was frigid. He found her shivering violently in her nest of hay, her teeth chattering, her skin bathed in a sheen of sweat despite the cold. The fever was back, and it had its teeth in her. He touched her forehead, and it was like laying his hand on a hot stove. He knew, with a sinking feeling, that the wound in her side must be festering. The bandages he had put on her were days old, likely soaked and dirty. He had to change them. He knelt beside her, his lantern casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. "I need to look at your side," he said, his voice barely a whisper above the wind. "The fever is high. I have to change the dressing." Her eyes flew open, wide and lucid with a sudden, sharp terror. She shook her head, a small, frantic motion. "No," she breathed, the word a ragged puff of white in the cold air. "Please," he said, his own voice unsteady. "You will die if I do not." He reached for the edge of the blanket, and she flinched away as if he had struck her. She pushed herself back against the wall, her hands coming up to clutch the blankets to her chest. A desperate, pleading look filled her eyes, a look of such profound and naked fear that it stopped his heart. "Please, don't remove my clothes," she begged, her voice breaking into a sob. "Please." The words shattered him. It was not just a plea, it was an indictment. It was the terrified cry of a girl who had seen and known a violence he could only imagine. A girl for whom a man's touch meant only pain and humiliation. It was the voice of her people, of every woman who had ever been at the mercy of a conqueror, and he was one of them. The shame was so intense it felt like a physical blow, stealing the air from his lungs. He looked down at his own hands, calloused and capable, the hands of a rancher, a fighter, a killer. He saw them for what they must be to her, the instruments of her terror. His heart ached with a pain so sharp it mirrored her own. "I will not," he swore, his voice thick with an emotion he could not name. "I promise you, I will not, but I must get to the wound." He fumbled for his knife, the same one he had used before, and showed it to her. "I will only cut the bandage, nothing else, I will keep my eyes down. I swear it on my brother's grave. I swear it." He did not know why he said it, but the oath felt sacred, the only thing of value he had left to offer. She stared at him, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The fight in her seemed to collapse, leaving only a trembling exhaustion. She gave a slow, defeated nod, her eyes closing as if she could not bear to watch. With a heart that felt like it was breaking with every beat, he set to work. He kept his promise, keeping his gaze lowered, focusing only on the narrow strip of her skin where the soiled bandage was. He used his knife to carefully snip the knot and gently unwound the linen. The wound was red and angry, just as he had feared. He worked with a deliberate slowness, his movements careful and respectful. He cleaned the wound again with carbolic acid and water, his touch as light as he could make it. She whimpered softly when the antiseptic stung, a sound that lanced through him. He wrapped her side with fresh linen, his fingers brushing against her hot skin. The contact was agonizing, a reminder of the chasm of fear and history that separated them. When he was finished, he pulled the blankets back up to her chin, his hands shaking. He did not return to the house that night. He could not. He sat in the main aisle of the barn, his back against a post, the lantern burning low beside him. He stared into the darkness, listening to the sound of her fevered breathing and the screaming of the wind. Sleep was an impossible dream. He closed his eyes and saw her face, the terror in her eyes. He saw the burning village from his memory, heard the cries. He saw Jacob falling, an arrow in his back. The images swirled together in his mind, a maelstrom of guilt and grief. What had his people done? What had he done? He had ridden under a banner of progress, of taming a wild land, but in the dark, cold silence of his barn, with a dying girl in his care, it all felt like a lie. He was not a hero. He was not a righteous avenger. He was just another man with blood on his hands, haunted by the ghosts he had helped create. The fever broke 2 days later. He found her one morning sitting up, the blankets pooled around her waist. The wild, fevered look was gone from her eyes. They were clear and dark, and they were watching him as he approached. The silence between them felt different now, less a wall of fear and more a space of quiet contemplation. She was the first to break it. Her voice was weak, raspy from disuse, but the words were clear. "Where am I?" she asked. Eli stopped, the pail of water in his hand. He had rehearsed answers to 100 questions in his mind, but now that the moment was here, his tongue felt thick. "You are in my barn," he said simply. "In Texas." She absorbed this, her gaze sweeping over the rough wooden walls, the hay-filled loft, the leather harnesses hanging from pegs. Her eyes returned to his. "Who are you?" "My name is Eli Carson." She was quiet for a long moment. He could see the questions forming in her mind, the confusion and the fear still warring for dominance. Finally, she asked the one that mattered most. "Why did you not turn me in?" He set the bucket down, the handle creaking in the stillness. He looked at her, at the hollows beneath her cheekbones, at the faded bruise on her temple. He thought of all the reasons he could give her, that he felt guilty, that he was repaying a debt he did not know how to name, but none of them felt true enough. The truth was simpler, and far more complicated. "I do not know," he admitted, his voice low and honest. I could not watch another person die." His answer seemed to satisfy her. She did not press him further. From that day on, the silence began to recede. She started to speak more, in short, halting phrases. She told him her name was Naira. She asked about the horses, about the land outside the barn. He answered her questions as best he could, and a fragile bridge of words began to form between them, spanning the chasm of their two worlds. One morning, a week later, a soft, wet snow began to fall, blanketing the brown plains in a layer of pristine white. The world outside the barn was muffled and hushed. When Eli entered, he found Naira standing unsteadily in the wide-open doorway, leaning against the frame for support. She was staring out at the falling snow, her back to him. The rising sun was a pale, watery glow behind the clouds, and its gentle light filtered into the barn, illuminating her. The snowflakes, delicate and white, drifted down around her, catching in the black strands of her unbound hair like tiny stars. She had turned her face up toward the sky, and in that quiet, silvered light, Eli saw her. He did not see a Comanche or a raider or an enemy. He saw the graceful line of her neck, the strength in her fragile shoulders, the curve of her lips, parted in silent wonder. He saw a woman, and the unexpected, breathtaking beauty of her struck him with the force of a physical blow. A feeling he had not felt in years, a feeling he had no right to feel, stirred in the empty place where his heart used to be. The moment was shattered by the sound of hoofbeats and the barking of dogs. Panic, cold and sharp, seized him. He looked past her and saw them, a group of 4 riders, rifles resting across their saddles, making their way up the track toward his homestead. A posse. "Get back!" he hissed, his voice tight with urgency. He rushed forward, grabbing her arm. She stumbled, her eyes wide with confusion and alarm. "Inside, now! Hide!" He half pushed, half dragged her toward the back of the barn, his mind racing. There was nowhere to go. He scanned the cluttered space, and his eyes fell on a large, dusty canvas tarp bunched in a corner, used for covering wagons in the rain. "Under here," he commanded, pulling it back. "Do not make a sound. Do not move. No matter what you hear." She scrambled beneath it without a word, curling into a small ball. He threw the heavy canvas over her, arranging it to look like a forgotten pile of equipment. He kicked some loose hay around the edges, his heart hammering against his ribs. "Eli, you in there?" a voice called from outside. It was Tom Prentice, a rancher from the neck spread over. Eli took a deep, steadying breath and walked to the barn door, forcing a look of weary annoyance onto his face. "Tom," he said, squinting against the bright snow, "what is all the racket?" "Morning, Eli. Sorry to bother you. We're just making another sweep. Found tracks a few miles south of here, a small group. We think maybe some of the stragglers from the raid." Tom's eyes scanned the interior of the barn, lingering on the stall Eli had claimed for his lame mare. "Still doctoring that horse?" "She is a stubborn case," Eli said, stepping out and pulling the barn door almost closed behind him, blocking the view. "What makes you think they would come this way?" "Nowhere else for them to go," another man said, spitting. "We'll hunt every last one of them down before spring. You have not seen anything unusual? Heard anything?" "Nothing but the wind." Eli lied, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. He could feel Naira's presence behind him, could feel her breathing under the heavy canvas. The thought that these men were feet away from her, that their casual hatred could erupt into violence at any moment, made his blood run cold. They talked for a few more minutes, exchanging grim news and reaffirming their commitment to vengeance. To Eli, their voices sounded distant, like sounds from another world. His entire being was focused on the pile of canvas in the corner of his barn. Finally, Tom gathered his reins. "Well, we will keep looking. You give a shout if you see anything." "I will," Eli said. He stood and watched them ride away, their dark shapes disappearing into the falling snow. He did not move until they were completely gone. Then he turned and hurried back inside the barn, his boots silent on the dirt floor. He pulled back the canvas. Naira was pale, her eyes enormous in the dim light. She had heard every word. She had heard the casual way they spoke of hunting her people. She had felt the weight of his lie as it settled between them and the outside world. She looked at him, and in her gaze, he saw a new understanding. She finally saw the full measure of the risk he had taken. She knew that he had not just saved her from the creek. He had just saved her from the rope and the gun. He had stood between her and his own kind. She pushed herself to her feet, her legs still weak. She stood before him, so close he could see the snowflakes melting on her eyelashes. Her lips parted, and she whispered the same question she had asked before. But this time, it held a world of new meaning. It was not a question of logistics, but of the soul. Why? Eli looked into her dark, searching eyes and found he had no answer. The simple truth he had given her before, "I could not watch another person die," was no longer enough. It was not enough to explain why his heart had pounded in his chest with a fear greater than any he had ever known in battle, or why the thought of them finding her had felt like his own personal end. He could not explain it to her because he could not yet explain it to himself. He could only stand there in the quiet of the barn, the scent of snow and hay in the air, and shake his head. The snow melted, and the world began to change. The iron-hard ground, frozen for months, softened into a dark, rich mud. The endless white of the plains gave way to the pale, hopeful green of new grass. Water, freed from its icy prison, trickled and then gushed, filling the creeks and arroyos with a lively, chattering song. The air itself felt different, losing its sharp, biting edge and carrying instead the damp, earthy scent of renewal. Spring was not a gentle arrival. It was a messy, muddy, and powerful reclamation of the land. Inside the barn, a similar thaw was taking place. As Naira's body healed, her spirit began to emerge from the frozen landscape of her trauma. The haunted, watchful look in her eyes was slowly replaced by a quiet curiosity. She grew stronger each day, the fragility giving way to a fluid grace as she moved about her confined world. The barn was no longer a prison, but a sanctuary, its shadowed corners and hay-filled loft becoming the only geography that mattered. She remained a secret, a ghost that lived between the worlds of the house and the open range. But within those wooden walls, she was no longer just surviving. She was beginning to live. The silence between them, once a vast and empty plain, was now filled with the tentative shoots of conversation. Their talks were not easy. They were halting, fragile things, built from broken sentences and long, thoughtful pauses. Grief was the soil from which their words grew. It was the one language they both knew fluently. One afternoon, as they sat in the open doorway of the barn, watching the clouds drift in a sky that was finally blue again, she began to speak of her home. She told him her father's name was Esatai, which meant Little Wolf. He was not just a warrior, she explained, but a chief, a man whose wisdom was as great as his courage. She spoke of him with a reverence that made Eli's heart ache, painting a picture of a man who loved his people and taught his daughter to see the spirit in the land, in the buffalo, and in the stars. Then, her voice growing softer, she spoke of the fire. She did not describe the fighting or the violence in detail, but spoke of the chaos, the screams that were swallowed by a sound like a great roar. She remembered the terrible heat and the sky turning black with smoke in the middle of the day. She spoke of running, of falling, of waking up in a world that had been burned to ash. And she spoke of her brother, Tama, who had been her shadow, her protector. She had last seen him running back into the smoke, toward the sound of their mother's voice. She never saw him again. Eli listened, his hands clenched into fists, his own grief a raw and open wound. The story was not just hers, it was a mirror of his own. The smoke, the screams, the stolen brother, it was all horribly familiar. When she fell silent, her gaze lost in the past, he found himself speaking, the words coming out rough and full of pain. "I had a brother, too," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "His name was Jacob." Naira turned to look at him, her dark eyes full of a sudden, shared understanding. "He died in the raid," Eli continued, the confession tearing at him. "The one before I found you. He was all the family I had left." He could not stop the words now that they had started. "For 2 days, I hated all of your people. I rode with the posse. I wanted to kill every last one of you." He finally looked at her, his expression raw with shame. "I thought you were all monsters, faceless, the way you were described in town. But then I found you, and you were just a girl, bleeding in the mud. And you had lost a brother, too. The space between them was electric with the weight of his confession. He had laid his ugliest thoughts bare, and he expected her to flinch away, to retreat back into her silence. Instead, she reached out, her fingers hovering for a moment before gently touching the back of his hand. It was the first time she had ever touched him willingly. The touch was light, brief, but it sent a shock through his entire body. "You are not a monster, Eli Carson," she said softly. "You are a man with a hole in his heart, like me." From that day forward, the nature of their time together changed. They were no longer just a caretaker and his ward. They were two survivors, sharing the wreckage. An unspoken pact was made. They would help each other rebuild. She began to teach him her language, the Numunu, the tongue of the people, as she called them. She pointed to things in the barn and gave them their true names. The sun streaming through the cracks was Tabe. The water in the bucket was Pa. Gideon, the horse who watched them with intelligent eyes, was a Puku. He was a clumsy student, his tongue thick and unfamiliar with the soft, flowing sounds. But he tried. Each word she taught him felt like a gift, a small piece of her world that she was entrusting to him. It chipped away at the wall of his ignorance, replacing the caricature of the savage with the reality of a culture, a history, a person. In return, he began to teach her to read. He brought an old, tattered primer from the house, the same one he and Jacob had learned from as boys. He sat beside her on a pile of hay, the book open on his lap, the scent of dust and old paper mixing with the smell of the barn. He pointed to the letters, sounding them out. A, B, C. She was a quick study, her mind sharp and hungry for knowledge. Soon, she could recognize the letters and sound out simple words: sun, horse, water, home. The shared act of learning created a new kind of intimacy between them, a quiet space where their two worlds could overlap. He would watch her brow furrow in concentration, the tip of her tongue caught between her teeth, and a feeling of profound tenderness would wash over him. So powerful it was almost painful. His feelings for her were becoming a quiet, unbearable storm inside him. He knew the danger, the absolute impossibility of it. She was a Comanche, and he was a white man who had fought her people. In the eyes of the world, any affection between them was a perversion, a betrayal. Loving her was a crime punishable by fire and rope. He would lie awake in his empty house at night, Jacob's silent presence filling the room, and feel the crushing weight of his transgression. He was protecting his brother's killer, a thought that felt like a lie even as he formed it. Yet, he could not stop the way his heart lurched in his chest when she smiled, a rare and beautiful thing that lit up her whole face. He could not stop watching the way the light caught in her hair or the graceful way she moved. He was her protector. Yes, but it was more than that now. He was falling in love with her, and he knew, with a terrifying certainty, that it would destroy him. The outside world intruded on a bright Sunday morning in the form of Reverend Josiah Miller. The preacher was a tall, gaunt man with eyes that seemed to see right through to a man's soul, or at least he made you feel as if they did. He rode up to the homestead on a tired-looking gray mule, his black coat dusty from the road. He said he had come to offer condolences for Eli's brother and to check on the state of his soul. Eli met him on the porch, his body a stiff and unwelcoming wall between the preacher and the rest of the ranch. They spoke of Jacob, of God's mysterious ways, of the vengeance that the town still thirsted for. Eli offered the man a drink of water, hoping to conclude the visit quickly. "A man needs community in a time of grief. Son," the preacher said, his sharp eyes scanning the property. "You have been keeping to yourself. The Lord's house has not seen you in months." "I have had work to do," Eli said, his voice flat. "The ranch does not run itself." "Of course," the preacher said, his gaze drifting toward the barn. "And you have hired help. I see. That is wise. A man cannot carry such burdens alone." Eli's blood ran cold. He had been so careful. "Just the same two hands as always," he said. The preacher smiled, a thin, knowing expression. "As I was riding up, I saw a shadow in the barn door. A woman's. It looked like I thought perhaps you had hired a cook or a maid to help in the house. A good Mexican woman? Perhaps." The lie came to Eli's lips so quickly it felt like an instinct. "Yes, a woman from down south. Maria. She helps with the mending and cleaning. She is shy, keeps to herself." "I see," Reverend Miller said, but his eyes lingered on the barn, a flicker of suspicion in their depths. The silence stretched on, filled with Eli's pounding heart. The preacher finally drained his cup and handed it back to Eli. "Well, you see that you take care of your spirit as well as your stock. Eli, the devil finds work for idle hands and grieving hearts." He mounted his mule and rode away, but Eli felt the man's suspicious gaze on his back long after he was gone. He stumbled back into his house, his hands shaking. It was a close call, a warning. The secret world he had built for Naira and himself was not as safe as he had imagined. Its walls were thin, and the outside world was always listening, always watching. That night, the fear and anxiety gnawed at him. He could not keep her in the barn forever, but what else could he do? To release her into the world was to sentence her to death. To keep her was to risk both of their lives. He went to the barn, the lantern in his hand casting a weak, trembling light. He found her awake, as if she had sensed his turmoil. He sat down across from her, the space between them feeling like a vast, dark canyon. "The preacher was here today," he said, his voice low and strained. "He saw you." She did not seem surprised. "I saw him," she answered. "I lied," Eli confessed, the words heavy with shame. "I told him you were a Mexican maid. I do not think he believed me. They will not stop looking. Naira, they will never stop. The world will never forgive me for this, for helping you." He looked down at his hands, the weight of his fear and his impossible love pressing down on him, suffocating him. He felt her move closer, and when he looked up, she was kneeling in front of him, her face illuminated in the soft lantern light. Her expression was not one of fear, but of a calm, quiet strength that stunned him. "Then let it be our secret world," she said softly. Her voice was a balm on his frayed soul. She was not asking for his protection. She was offering him a partnership. She was not a burden to be hidden, but a person to build a new world with, even if that world was only as large as a dusty barn. In that moment, he knew he was lost. He would burn down the whole world to keep this secret once safe. Later, after she had fallen asleep in her nest of hay, he stayed and watched her. The moonlight slanted through the high window of the loft, casting a silver glow over her sleeping form. Her face was relaxed in sleep, free from the lines of pain and fear that had been etched there for so long. An overwhelming wave of affection, so fierce and protective it stole his breath, washed over him. He reached out, his calloused hand trembling, and his fingers brushed against hers where it lay on the blanket. Her skin was soft, warm. The brief contact was like a bolt of lightning, a sudden, searing connection that lit up every dark corner of his soul. It was too much. He pulled his hand back as if burned, his heart hammering in his chest. He was shaken to his core by the intensity of his feelings, by the raw, desperate power of what he felt for this woman he was supposed to hate. He rose to his feet and stumbled out of the barn, gasping for air. The night sky was no longer clear. To the west, dark, heavy clouds were gathering on the horizon, obscuring the stars. The air was thick, heavy with the promise of a storm. A low, distant rumble echoed across the plains. It was the sound of thunder, a sign of the violence that was gathering, a promise of the trouble that was surely on its way. The distant thunder of that night was a prophecy. In the days that followed, the storm it foretold gathered not in the sky, but in the suspicious glances and poisoned whispers of men. Reverend Miller, it seemed, had not kept his observations to himself. He had planted a seed of doubt, and in the fertile ground of fear and hatred, it grew into a thorny vine of rumor that began to choke the life out of Eli's world. The whispers found a voice in Caleb Boone. Boone was a man carved from the same hard, unforgiving rock as the land itself. He had lost his wife and son in a Comanche raid 5 years prior, and the loss had scoured all softness from him, leaving behind a man who saw the world in the stark, brutal colors of vengeance. He was respected, his grief giving him a kind of grim authority among the other ranchers. When he began to speak openly of the preacher's visit to the Carson homestead, people listened. He did not accuse Eli directly at first. He simply wondered aloud in the town saloon, his voice carrying over the low murmur of conversation. He wondered why a grieving man like Eli Carson, who should be leaning on his neighbors, had suddenly become a recluse. He wondered about the story of the lame mare that never seemed to heal, and he wondered about the shadow of a woman that the preacher had seen. Soon, the whispers took on a more definite, more venomous shape. It was not just a woman. It was a Comanche woman. The idea was outlandish, a fever dream of paranoia, but in a community raw with loss, it took root. They were a people who saw murderers in every shadow, thieves in every rustle of the grass. The thought that one of their own might be harboring the enemy was not just a betrayal. It was sacrilege. Eli felt the pressure mount like a change in the atmosphere. When he rode into town for supplies, the conversations would stop as he entered the general store. Men who had known him since he was a boy, men who had helped him build his barn, now nodded curtly and turned away, their eyes hard and questioning. His own hands, Silas and Jeb, grew quiet and sullen. He would catch them watching him, their expressions a mixture of confusion and a dawning suspicion that made his stomach clench. The lie about the mare had worn thin, and they no longer asked about her. They simply did their work and kept their distance, leaving an empty space around Eli that felt colder than any winter wind. He was being tried and convicted in the court of public opinion, and he had no defense. The isolation was a heavy cloak, and he wore it every time he stepped outside the secret world of his barn. Naira saw the change in him. She saw the new lines of strain around his eyes, the way his shoulders were permanently tensed, as if bracing for a blow. She watched him return from town, his jaw set like stone, and she felt the danger he was in, a danger he had invited for her sake. Her guilt was a constant, bitter presence. She was a poison in his life, and she knew it would eventually destroy him. One evening, as he brought her the evening meal, she did not eat. She stood before him, her hands clasped tightly, her face pale but resolute. "You must let me go," she said, her voice quiet but firm. Eli stopped, the plate in his hands. "What are you talking about?" "I hear the way they shout your name when they ride past the property line," she said, her eyes glistening. "I see the look on your face when you come back from the town. I am a ghost that is haunting you. Eli Carson, a ghost that will get you killed." "That is foolishness," he said, his voice rough. "No," she insisted, taking a step closer. "It is the truth. Let me leave in the night. I am stronger now. I know the land. I can find my way." He looked at her, at the fierce determination in her eyes, a mirror of the defiance he had first seen as she lay dying in the creek. She was willing to walk back into the wilderness, to face the posses and the starvation and the cold, all to save him. The depth of her sacrifice, the sheer force of her care for him, broke through his fear. He set the plate down and gripped her shoulders, his touch more forceful than he intended. "No," he said, his voice low and intense. "Listen to me. You will not survive out there. Not now. They are hunting. They are angry. They will not ask questions. Leaving is not an option." He looked into her eyes, letting her see the raw, desperate truth of his feelings. "This is your home now. It is the only one we have." Her resolve crumbled, and a single tear traced a path down her cheek. He had not meant to trap her, but that is what he had done. He had made her safety his prison. The storm that had been threatening for days finally broke that night, unleashing its fury upon the plains. It was not a cleansing rain, but a violent, tearing assault. Wind screamed through the cracks in the barn, a sound like a soul in torment. Rain hammered against the roof in a deafening, relentless barrage. The old building groaned and shuddered under the onslaught, and for the first time their sanctuary felt fragile, vulnerable. A sudden stream of cold water splashed onto the floor near them. Eli looked up and saw a dark stain spreading on the ceiling. A section of the roof, weakened by age, had given way. "Damn it," he muttered, grabbing an empty bucket. He needed to get onto the loft and move the hay away before it was ruined, and try to patch the hole if he could. He grabbed his lantern and climbed the ladder, with Naira following close behind him, her face etched with worry. The loft was a chaotic whirl of wind and water. Rain drove in through a hole where several boards had been torn loose, whipping hay into the air. They worked together in the flickering, unstable light of the lantern, their movements urgent and synchronized. He found a loose piece of canvas and some spare planks, and together they fought against the storm to cover the hole. The wind tore at them, trying to rip the canvas from their hands. They were soaked and shivering, their bodies close together in the cramped space. As they struggled to nail down a loose board, her hand covered his to steady it against the force of the wind. Her skin was cold and wet, but where their hands touched, a spark of heat ignited. It shot up his arm and spread through his chest, a sudden, sharp pang of desire so intense it made him gasp. He looked at her, and in the wild lantern light, he saw his own feelings reflected in her wide, dark eyes. The world narrowed to the space of a single breath, the roar of the storm fading to a dull hum. It was a moment of pure, painful longing, a glimpse of a life they could never have, and it left them both trembling. Then the world exploded in a flash of white light. A deafening crack, louder than any thunder, shook the very foundations of the barn. A massive cottonwood tree just outside the loft window was struck by lightning, its trunk splitting with a sound of tortured, tearing wood. For a heart-stopping second, the night was as bright as day. The image of the fiery, shattered tree burned onto their retinas. Naira screamed. It was not a sound of fear, but of pure, undiluted terror. The sudden, violent flash of light, the smell of burning wood, the explosive sound. It was the fire. It was her village. It was the end of her world, happening all over again. She collapsed, her body shaking uncontrollably, her hands flying up to cover her face as if to ward off the flames of her memory. Eli forgot the storm, forgot the roof, forgot everything. He dropped the hammer and pulled her into his arms, holding her tight against his chest. "It is all right," he said, his voice a rough murmur against her hair. "It is just the storm. You are safe. I have you." She clung to him, her fingers digging into the wet fabric of his shirt, her sobs tearing through her body. He could feel the frantic, terrified beating of her heart against his own. He held her, stroking her hair, whispering reassurances, trying to anchor her to the present, to pull her back from the horror of the past. They were both trembling, caught in a whirlwind of her terror and his desperate need to protect her. Her sobs slowly subsided into ragged, shuddering breaths. She lifted her head, her face tear-streaked, her eyes dark and bottomless with a pain he could feel in his own soul. They were no longer a man and a woman in a storm. They were two broken, lonely people, clinging to the only warmth they had in a cold and violent world. The distance he had so carefully tried to maintain was gone, washed away by the rain and her tears. All restraint, all fear of consequence, all the carefully constructed walls between them, shattered in that moment. He lowered his head, and she met him halfway. Their kiss was not gentle or tender. It was desperate. It was a raw, aching collision of grief and gratitude, of fear and forbidden longing. It was the taste of rain and salt and a sorrow too deep for words. It was a drowning man's last breath, A final, defiant act in a world that was trying to tear them apart. For a moment, there was nothing but the press of her lips against his, the frantic pulse in her throat, the feeling of her body pressed against his own. It was a moment of impossible connection, a secret world made real. Then the weight of what he had done crashed down on him. Guilt, sharp and cold, pierced through the haze of emotion. He had broken every rule, betrayed every trust. He was her protector, and he had taken advantage of her terror. He pulled back abruptly, his breath catching in his throat, the space between them suddenly feeling like a desolate, empty chasm. "Naira, he started, but the words died on his lips. What could he say? Sorry was a useless, insulting word. She did not look angry or violated. She looked at him with a profound and heartbreaking sadness. She reached up and gently touched her fingers to his chest, right over his hammering heart. Her touch was not an accusation, but a benediction. "You saved me," she whispered, her voice still trembling. "But this will destroy you." The next day, the sun rose on a world washed clean. The air was fresh and cool, and the sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue. But the peace was a lie. The storm had passed, but its wreckage remained, both in the shattered tree outside and in the tense, unspoken silence inside the barn. Eli was fixing the corral fence when he heard the hoofbeats. It was not one rider, but a group, coming fast. He looked up, his hand freezing on the rail. It was Caleb Boone, and he had 5 men with him. They were not carrying tools. They were carrying rifles. His heart dropped. He ran for the barn, his mind racing. "Naira," he yelled, bursting through the door. "They are here! You have to hide! Now!" She was already on her feet, her face pale with the same dread that was coiling in his gut. He led her to the small, cluttered tack room at the back of the barn. In the far corner, beneath a pile of old saddles and stiff leather hides, was a thick plank that served as a trap door. He had built it years ago to store potatoes and root vegetables through the winter. It was small, dark, and smelled of damp earth. "In here," he commanded, throwing the saddles aside and heaving the door open. "It is not deep. Be quiet. Do not make a sound, no matter what happens." She looked at him, her eyes wide with fear for him. She squeezed his hand, a quick, desperate gesture, and then lowered herself into the dark hole. He slid the heavy door back into place and frantically covered it again, scattering dirt and straw over the seams until it was nearly invisible. He took his Winchester from its pegs on the wall just as Caleb Boone and his men dismounted outside. Eli stepped out into the bright sunlight, the rifle held loosely in his hands. "Boone," he said, his voice dangerously calm. "Carson," Caleb replied, his eyes like chips of flint. His men spread out, flanking him. "We have come to put an end to this foolishness. We have it on good authority you are hiding a Comanche squaw on this property." "You have it on rumor and gossip," Eli countered, standing his ground in front of the barn door. "And you are not welcome on my land. This is not your land anymore if you are a traitor to your own kind." Caleb sneered. "We are going to search that barn. Either you step aside, or we move you aside." Eli raised the Winchester, the movement smooth and deliberate, and levered a round into the chamber. The click was unnervingly loud in the quiet morning air. "The first man who takes a step past me is the first man who dies," he said, his voice cold and even. "I am burying one brother. I have no problem burying another man." Caleb's men hesitated, their eyes shifting from Eli's rifle to Caleb's face. Boone stared at Eli, a flicker of surprise in his eyes at the steel he saw there. This was not the grieving, withdrawn man they had been whispering about. This was a man with nothing left to lose. For a long, tense moment, no one moved. The only sound was the wind whispering through the new spring grass. Finally, Caleb gave a slight, almost imperceptible shake of his head to his men. "There is no need for bloodshed. Carson, not yet. We will search your house first. Then we will search the barn." Eli knew he could not stop them. He could not shoot them all. He lowered the rifle but did not step aside. He watched as two of Boone's men searched his small house, tossing things aside, their movements rough and disrespectful. They found nothing. Then they turned their attention to the barn. Eli's heart hammered against his ribs as they pushed past him. He could only watch as they overturned stalls, kicked through piles of hay, and prodded the shadows with their rifle barrels. Every sound was magnified, every second an eternity. He prayed Naira would remain silent, that the dirt-covered trap-door would hold. The search ended with nothing but a few spooked horses and a barn in disarray. Caleb Boone stood in the center of the mess, his face a mask of frustration and suspicion. He walked up to Eli, his eyes burning with cold fire. "You are a good liar, Carson," he said, his voice low and menacing. "But you cannot hide forever. We know she is here, and we will be watching." He pointed a finger at Eli's chest. "And when we find her, and we will, if you are still lying, we will burn this place to the ground with you in it." He turned without another word and led his men away. Eli stood there, the Winchester heavy in his hands, and watched them go. The adrenaline drained out of him, leaving him cold and empty. He waited until they were specks on the horizon before he went back into the barn and opened the trap door. Naira emerged, blinking in the light, her face streaked with dirt. He reached down and helped her out, his touch gentle. She looked at the disarray around them, then at his face. She did not need to ask what had happened. He looked around at the wreckage of his barn, at the sanctuary they had built, now violated and torn apart. He looked at her, at the woman for whom he had just aimed a rifle at his neighbors. In the quiet aftermath, a cold, hard certainty settled in his soul. There was no turning back. He had made his choice in the flashing light of the storm, and he had sealed it with a gun in the bright morning sun. He had chosen her, and all the danger that came with her. Their secret world was all they had left, and the whole world was coming to burn it down. The summer arrived like a fever, turning the green plains to a shimmering, brittle gold. The heat was a physical presence, a weight that settled over the land, baking the earth into a network of cracks and silencing the birds in the heat of the day. For Eli and Naira, it was a season of cruel beauty. The world outside their small homestead was vibrant with life. But for them, it had become a cage, its boundaries defined by the unending horizon and the constant, vigilant fear of being seen. Caleb Boone's threat had poisoned the very air they breathed. Every distant plume of dust was a rider approaching, every bark of a stray dog a warning. They lived their lives in the margins of the day, in the deep shadows of the barn during the heat and in the soft, forgiving darkness of the night. Naira no longer stayed only in the barn. She moved between its familiar scent of hay and the quiet, lonely rooms of Eli's house, a ghost in her own home, her presence a secret kept from the sun itself. In this crucible of fear, their relationship deepened, forged into something quiet, strong, and deeply aching. Love, for them, was not found in grand declarations, but in small, stolen moments of peace that felt like acts of defiance against the world. They created a life in the shadows, a tapestry woven from simple, domestic threads. Behind the house, hidden from the main track by a stand of cottonwoods, they planted a small garden. They turned the soil together, his strength and her knowledge of the earth combining in a silent, easy rhythm. He would watch her press the small seeds into the dark soil, her touch gentle and sure, and feel a hope so fierce it was painful. They were planting food, yes, but they were also planting a testament that even here, in this hunted existence, something beautiful could be allowed to grow. In the evenings, she would sometimes sit by the light of a single lamp, mending his worn work shirts. He would sit across the small kitchen table, pretending to read an old newspaper. But his eyes would be on her. He would watch the focused intensity of her expression, the graceful movement of her hands as she pulled the thread tight, and he would feel a love so profound it left him breathless. In these moments, she was not a Comanche, not a fugitive, but the quiet center of his entire world. The nights were their sanctuary. When the last light had faded and the plains were awash in the silver of the moon and a million stars, they would sit on the porch steps, hidden in the darkness. The world was asleep, and they could finally breathe. She would tell him more stories of her people, of their beliefs, of the way they saw the patterns of the gods in the stars above. He would tell her about his and Jacob's foolish childhood dreams of building the biggest cattle ranch in Texas. They talked of everything and nothing, their voices low murmurs in the vast, sleeping silence. This was their love, a quiet, aching thing, beautiful in its fragility and heartbreaking in its impossibility. But the shadow of the outside world was long, and it stretched even into their secret nights. The ranch was dying. Eli's isolation was no longer just social. It was economic. Cattle buyers, spooked by Caleb Boone's rumors, no longer came to his gates. When he tried to sell his stock in town, he was met with low, insulting offers or outright refusals. The fences sagged, the stock grew thin, and the dream he and Jacob had poured their sweat and blood into was crumbling into dust around him. The final blow came on a sweltering afternoon in late July. Silas and Jeb, his two ranch hands, approached him as he worked on a broken pump. They stood with their hats in their hands, their faces grim, unable to meet his eyes. "We are quitting, boss," Silas said, his voice low. Eli was not surprised, but the words still hit him like a physical blow. "I see." "It is not you, exactly," Jeb added, shifting his weight uncomfortably. "But folks are talking. Caleb Boone. He is making it hard for anyone associated with you. We have got families. Eli, we cannot afford to be on his bad side." "I understand," Eli said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. He did not blame them. They were just men trying to survive, and he was a sinking ship. He paid them their final wages, and they left without another word, leaving him utterly and completely alone. Naira had watched the exchange from the kitchen window. That evening, the weight of his despair was a palpable thing in the small house. He sat at the table, staring at a plate of food he had not touched, the silence stretching between them. She came and stood behind him, her hands resting gently on his shoulders. He could feel the tremor in her fingers. "This is my fault," she whispered, her voice thick with guilt. "The ranch, your brother's dream. It is dying because of me." She walked around the table to face him, her eyes pleading. "I told you once before, and I am telling you again. You must let me go. It is the only way. I will leave tonight. You can tell them you found me and turned me out. Maybe they will believe you. Maybe Caleb will leave you be." Eli looked up at her, at the beautiful, earnest face of the woman who was offering to sacrifice herself to save the wreckage of his life. He saw the empty corrals, the silent bunkhouse, the fields that were slowly being reclaimed by the wild grass. He saw the ghost of his brother in every corner of the house, and he knew, with absolute clarity, that none of it mattered anymore. The land, the cattle, the house, they were just things, an empty shell. He reached across the table and took her hand, his grip tight and desperate. "Listen to me," he said, his voice raw with an emotion that stripped him bare. "Before you, this house was already empty. After Jacob died, it was just a place filled with ghosts. You are the only thing that has made it feel like a home. You are the only thing that makes any of this mean anything." He looked into her eyes and let her see the terrifying, unconditional truth of his heart. "Without you, this house is empty again. So you cannot leave. Do you understand? You cannot leave me." The words hung in the air, a confession and a plea. She sank to her knees before him, her hand still in his, and rested her head on his lap. He could feel her silent tears soaking into the rough denim of his trousers. In that moment, They were not a white man and a Comanche woman. They were just a man and a woman, stripped of everything but their love for each other, a love that was both their salvation and their doom. Later that night, a soft summer rain began to fall. It was not a violent storm like the one that had thrown them together, but a gentle, steady drumming on the roof, washing the dust from the air and cooling the parched earth. It was a sound of healing, of peace. He came to her in the small bedroom, where she stood by the window, watching the rain trace paths down the glass. The air was soft and cool. He stood behind her, and when he placed his hands on her arms, she leaned back against him, her body fitting against his as if it were made to be there. All the fear, all the guilt, all the carefully guarded boundaries dissolved in the quiet rhythm of the rain. He turned her to face him, his hands cupping her face, his thumbs gently stroking her cheekbones. There were no words. There was no need for them. Everything they felt was in his touch, in the deep, unguarded look in her eyes. This was not the desperate, frantic kiss of the storm. This was something else entirely. He lowered his head and kissed her slowly, tenderly, a kiss of profound and aching love. They made love that night not with the passion of a stolen moment, but with the slow, reverent tenderness of two souls seeking refuge. Every touch was a question, every caress an answer. It was a quiet, sacred act, a gentle mending. It felt as if they were tracing the edges of each other's scars, both visible and invisible, and healing them with a silent, unspoken promise that for this one night, in this one room, they were not hunted, they were not forbidden, they were simply home. But their peace was as fragile as a spider's web in the morning dew. It was not meant to last. 2 days later, Jeb, the younger of his former ranch hands, rode back to the homestead. He had left a whittling knife, a gift from his father, in the bunkhouse, and had come back, shamefaced, to retrieve it. He approached quietly, not wanting a confrontation with Eli. As he neared the back of the house, he stopped, frozen in his tracks. There, in the early morning light, standing by the small, hidden garden, was a woman. She was Comanche. There was no mistaking it. Her long, black hair was unbound, and she was wearing a simple calico dress that Eli must have given her. She was bending down to touch the leaves of a squash plant, her face soft and serene in the golden light. It was her, the woman from the rumors. It was all true. For a moment, Jeb just stared, a cold knot of fear and confusion tightening in his stomach. Then, he backed away slowly. His heart pounding, he mounted his horse and rode away, not toward his own small claim, but toward the ranch of Caleb Boone. The attack came just after sunset. There was no warning. One moment, Eli and Naira were sharing a quiet meal in the kitchen. The next, the world erupted. A sudden, hellish glow lit up the windows as torches appeared at the edges of the property. The sound of shouting voices, distorted by rage, echoed across the plains, followed by the splintering crack of a rifle shot. "They are here," Eli said, the words cold and dead. He grabbed his Winchester, his movements economical and swift. "Naira, the horses, now!" There was no time for a plan, no time for fear. They burst out the back door as the first of the mob rounded the side of the house. Men on horseback, their faces ugly in the flickering torchlight, carrying rifles and ropes. It was not a posse. It was a lynch mob. Eli fired a shot over their heads, the blast momentarily scattering them. It was the only diversion he could afford. They ran for the barn, the shouts and curses of the mob chasing them. They managed to get the saddles on Gideon and a fast-looking bay mare, their hands fumbling in the dark. They burst out of the barn doors just as Caleb Boone and his men converged on them. "There they are, get them!" Caleb roared. They dug their heels into their horses' sides and fled into the night, a wild, desperate race across the open plains. Torches bobbed behind them like angry, vengeful fireflies. Rifle shots cracked the air, bullets whining past their ears. It was a nightmare of chaos and terror, the pounding of hooves and the pounding of their own hearts, the only rhythm in a world gone mad. They were gaining ground, their horses fresh, when a shot from the darkness found its mark. Eli cried out, a sharp, ragged sound, and slumped forward in his saddle, his grip on the reins going slack. "Eli!" Naira screamed, her voice torn away by the wind. She saw the dark stain spreading across his shoulder and back. Without a second thought, she reached out, grabbed Gideon's reins, and pulled the horse alongside her own. She had to get them out of the open. She veered sharply, heading for the dark, jagged line of the canyons that cut through the plains, a place she knew from the stories of her people. It was broken land, a maze of rock and shadow where a few could evade many. She dragged his horse and him into the labyrinth of stone, the sounds of the chase growing more distant, confused by the echoes of the canyon walls. Rain began to fall again, a cold, miserable drizzle that soaked them to the bone and turned the ground to slick mud. She found a deep overhang, a shallow cave carved out of the rock, and guided the horses inside, out of sight. She half-dragged, half-lowered Eli from the saddle. He was conscious, but his face was pale and slick with sweat, his breathing shallow. The scene was raw, a tableau of pain and desperation. The hunted lovers, clinging to each other in the cold, driving rain. His blood was hot and sticky on her hands. The world had found them. It had torn down the walls of their secret home and cast them out into the violent darkness. She held him close, trying to shield him from the cold, listening to the distant, angry shouts of the men who would not stop until they were both dead, knowing that the world would never, ever forgive them. Eli came back to the world in pieces. The first piece was the cold, a damp, seeping chill that seemed to emanate from the stone beneath him. The next was pain, a hot, throbbing fire in his shoulder that pulsed with every beat of his heart. And the last piece was a sound, a soft, desperate whispering, a prayer spoken in a language he was just beginning to understand. He opened his eyes. The world was a blur of shadow and flickering, weak light. He was in a cave, a shallow overhang of rock that smelled of wet earth and rain. Naira was beside him, her face a pale oval in the gloom. Illuminated by a small, sputtering fire she had somehow managed to build from damp twigs. Her hands, covered in his blood, were trembling as she pressed a strip of cloth torn from the hem of her own dress against his wound. Her eyes were wide with a terror that was not for herself, but for him. "Naira," he rasped, his throat raw. She started, relief and anguish warring on her face. "Eli, do not try to speak. You have a fever." He could feel it now, a heat that had nothing to do with the small fire, a burning behind his eyes that made the shadows dance and swim. The posse, the chase, the sudden, searing impact, it all came rushing back. They were so close, he managed. "The canyons confused them," she said, her voice a strained whisper. "But they will not stop searching. We heard them, up on the ridge, an hour ago." He knew she was right. They had bought themselves a few hours. Nothing more. He was a wounded animal, and the hunters were closing in. He tried to push himself up, a wave of dizziness and white-hot pain washing over him, forcing him back down with a groan. "You must rest," she insisted, her touch on his uninjured shoulder surprisingly strong. He lay back, his head swimming, and watched her as she tended to him. She worked with a frantic, desperate focus, her movements jerky with fear but driven by a fierce determination. She had cleaned the wound as best she could with rainwater collected in a hollow of the rock. She had torn her dress into bandages. She had built a fire in the damp cold. She was saving his life, just as he had once saved hers. The bitter irony was not lost on him. As the night wore on and his fever waxed and waned, she spoke to him. Her voice was a low, steady anchor in the swirling chaos of his pain. She did not speak of the chase, or of the men who were hunting them. She spoke of her home, of the world she had lost. She told him that among her people, love was a sacred thing, a bond that was celebrated as a source of strength, not a crime to be punished. She spoke of how families were woven together, a net of connection and support that held everyone. A man and a woman choosing each other was a thing of joy, a promise that strengthened the whole tribe. It was not something to be hidden in barns, not a secret to be whispered in the dark. "My mother and father," she said, her gaze fixed on the small, dancing flames. They would sit together in the evenings. He would smoke his pipe, and she would be working a piece of leather. They would not speak for hours, but you could feel the strength between them. It was in the air. It was the heart of our home. Her voice broke, and she paused, swallowing against the grief. "In your world," she continued, her voice barely a whisper, "love is a weakness. It is a thing to be ashamed of if it crosses a line you have drawn in the dust. They hate you because you did not hate me. They want to kill you because you chose to save me." She turned to look at him then, her eyes dark and luminous in the firelight, glistening with unshed tears. She reached out and gently brushed a strand of damp hair from his forehead, her touch as soft as a moth's wing. "When you found me at the creek, I saw only an enemy," she said, her voice so soft he had to strain to hear it. "Another white man who would bring only pain, but you were not. You brought me water. You brought me warmth. You stood between me and the men with guns. You showed me that a person's heart is not the color of their skin." She leaned closer, her breath warm against his cheek. "You are not my enemy, Eli Carson. You are my home." The simple, profound truth of her words settled over him, a moment of perfect, heartbreaking clarity in the midst of his pain. He had lost his brother, his ranch, his place in the world. He had lost everything. But in this dark, cold cave, hunted and dying, he had found his home in the heart of a woman he was supposed to despise. It was the only thing that mattered. Dawn came reluctantly, a slow seeping of gray light into the mouth of the cave that revealed the stark, unforgiving landscape around them. The rain had stopped, but the air was cold and heavy. With the light came the sounds of the world waking up, and with them, a sound that made their blood run cold, the clatter of a horse's hoof on loose rock. Far above them, but drawing closer, Eli struggled to sit up. His teeth gritted against the pain. The fire was out. The end had arrived. "Naira," he said, his voice urgent. "You have to run, now! Follow the canyon downstream. It will lead you out to the broken lands. They will not be able to track you there. Go, while there is still time." She looked at him, her expression a mixture of love and stubborn defiance. "No," she said simply, "I will not leave you." "Do not be a fool," he pleaded, grabbing her arm with his good hand. "They want you. If I am alone, maybe they will just finish it. If you are here, they will make it cruel. Please, Naira, for me, run." "My home is here," she answered, placing her hand over his. "I will not run from it." The sound of horses was closer now, directly above them on the canyon ridge. They could hear men's voices. Caleb Boone's sharp commands cutting through the morning air. There was no more time. With a surge of adrenaline, Eli pushed himself to his feet, leaning against the rock wall for support. His shoulder was a blaze of agony, and his shirt was stiff with his own dried blood. But he stood. He would not die on the ground like an animal. He would face them on his own 2 feet. As Caleb and his men appeared at the top of the narrow trail leading down to the cave, Eli stumbled out into the gray morning light. He stood there, unarmed, bleeding, but his eyes were clear and defiant. He was a man who had made his choice, and he would not repent. The men pulled up their horses, their expressions a mixture of triumph and shock. This was not the scene they had expected. They had expected to find a cornered man, perhaps a body. They did not expect to find him waiting for them, looking them in the eye. Then, Naira stepped out of the cave and stood beside him. She was unarmed, her dress torn and stained, her face pale and streaked with grime. But she stood tall, her head held high. She reached out and took Eli's hand, her fingers lacing through his. The gesture was simple, intimate, and profoundly shocking. It was not the act of a captive. It was the act of a wife. The men on their horses stared, their righteous fury momentarily forgotten, replaced by a stunned confusion. The rumors, the whispers. They had painted a picture of a savage squaw, a debased woman who had bewitched one of their own. But the sight before them was something else entirely. It was a man and a woman, wounded and exhausted, holding hands as they faced the end of their world. A few of the men lowered their rifles slightly, their certainty shaken. All but one. Caleb Boone's face was a mask of pure, undiluted hatred. His loss had left no room in his heart for doubt or compassion. He saw not a woman, but the creature that had taken his family. He saw not a man he once knew, but a traitor who had sided with the enemy. "There's the witch," he snarled, raising his rifle. He did not aim at Eli. He aimed directly at Naira. It happened in the space of a heartbeat. There was no thought, only instinct. Eli moved, shoving Naira behind him, shielding her with his own body just as the rifle cracked. The bullet struck him high in the chest, the impact throwing him backward. He did not fall immediately. He staggered, his eyes wide with a final, desperate look of love for her. Then his legs gave out, and he collapsed to the ground. Naira's scream was a sound of pure, soul-tearing anguish, a sound that echoed off the canyon walls and silenced every other noise. She threw herself down beside him, cradling his head in her lap, her hands frantically trying to staunch the new, bright red blood that was pouring from his chest. "Eli, no, no, please!" she sobbed, her tears falling onto his face, mingling with the rain and the blood. He looked up at her, his eyes already beginning to glaze over. He could feel the life draining out of him, the world going cold and distant. He lifted his good hand, his fingers trembling, and touched her cheek, one last time. "It broke me, Naira," he whispered, his voice a ragged breath. "Because I never wanted to hurt you." His hand fell away. His eyes, fixed on her face, went still, and then he was gone. The world went silent. The men on the ridge sat frozen on their horses, the sound of the gunshot still ringing in their ears. The deed was done, but there was no victory in it. They had just watched a man die for love, and the sight had left a hollowness in their souls that vengeance could not fill. Without a word, Caleb Boone turned his horse and rode away, his men following like shadows, leaving the woman and her dead in the quiet of the canyon. Naira did not move. She stayed there, holding Eli's body, rocking him gently as the sun climbed higher in the sky, its warmth finally reaching the cold floor of the canyon. She did not weep anymore. Her grief was a thing beyond tears, a vast, silent emptiness that had consumed her world. She was still there in the late afternoon when a figure appeared at the end of the canyon. It was an old woman, her face a roadmap of wrinkles, her back bent with age. She was from one of the small, hard-scrabble settlements that clung to life in the breaks, a place forgotten by most. She carried a shovel and a water skin. She did not speak. She did not have to. She walked up to Naira, her eyes full of a deep, ancient sorrow, the sorrow of a woman who had seen too much death. Together, in silence, they took Eli to the top of the ridge. They buried him in the rocky soil, in a place that overlooked the vast, golden plains that he had loved, a place where he could see the sunrise. When it was done, the old woman pressed the water skin into Naira's hands, gave her a piece of dried meat from a pouch at her belt, and then simply walked away, disappearing back into the harsh landscape that had made her. Naira stayed by the fresh grave until the first light of dawn painted the eastern sky in shades of rose and gold. The air was cool and clean. She was alone, utterly and completely alone. She looked down at the simple coat Eli had worn, which she had taken from his body before the burial. It smelled of him, of dust and leather and the faint, lingering scent of wood smoke. She slipped it on, the sleeves too long, the shoulders too broad. It hung on her small frame, a final, inadequate embrace. She turned her back on the grave and began to walk, a solitary figure heading into the rising sun. Her tears, silent and steady, glistened on her cheeks, catching the new light. They mixed with the dust kicked up by her weary feet, with the wind that whispered through the tall grass, becoming one with the land itself. Theirs was a love that the world of men could not allow, so it was burned into the earth, a story of sorrow and sacrifice written on the heart of the wild, empty plains. Thank you for listening to our story. Please comment where you are from so we can all connect. Subscribe to our From Wild West channel and share your thoughts with us in English.